live. I am reading out of Time Out of Mind. It is the autobiography of Joan Grant. She was a seer and a farm memory writer. Sorry, I just wanted to finish it before it gets cold again. She was famous for her book Winged Pharaoh, which was published in the 30s, and Life as Carola, another famous of her farm memory books. She used to remember her reincarnations and wrote books about them and was quite famous. She died in 1989. I am now in the fourth part of this book, and it's chapter 5. The Rain Came. Although it is difficult to make a first choice among the servants to whom I have been grateful and devoted, I think Abdullah was the most perfect. He could speak a little English, and with enormous goodwill on both sides and plenty of intuition, we could converse freely. He was highly intelligent, beautiful to look at, and had great dignity. At meals, he stood beside my chair, for though it was not necessary for him to appear in the dining room, he preferred to wait on me himself. He even washed and ironed my clothes, as well as any lady's maid could have done. Perhaps the first time he recognized me as an ally, not only of himself but of his people, was when a visitor came to lunch 3 days after I arrived. He was, I regret to say, a senior British officer. He was also a fat, red-faced man with fish-pale eyes. He began to talk about the Arabs as wogs, using every belittling and contemptuous phrase to which he could lay his doubtless liver-fatted tongue. I fixed him with my eyes, which are always as dark and sometimes as penetrating as any Arab's. I spoke loudly and clearly so that Abdullah would be sure to hear every word. I entirely disagree, Colonel. I think God made only one real error of taste, when he made pink men. The diet of the diggers, the house servants, had basically the same food as ourselves, was, by European standards, appallingly inadequate. Most of them subsisted entirely on the rubbery Arab bread, baked in flat, unleavened loaves on hot stones. Though a few of the slightly less poverty-stricken varied their diet with an occasional egg or an onion. The majority smoked at least 50 native cigarettes a day, which, so far as I can remember, cost 3 pence a 100. I wanted to organize a soup kitchen for them, so that at least they could begin and end their long day's work with something hot and nourishing in their stomachs. But this was forbidden, and as I was only a guest, I could not go against the policy of the expedition. Next to the servants' quarters, there was a small storeroom, where minimal first aid equipment was kept for them. Mary, from long experience in Egypt and Iraq, knew that in a country where more than half the children were blind, or nearly so, from ophthalmics, because their mothers considered it the will of Allah that flies should cluster on their festering eyes, we were as helpless to make any lasting difference as we would have been if we had tried to dam the river Euphrates with a bundle of straw. Every evening she doled out castor oil, which they sucked down avidly, and gave them glycerin when their hands were so dry that the flesh had cracked open and prevented them from holding a pick. But I, the new broom, was rather more ambitious. Most of the men who came for treatment had monstrous boils. I thought these were caused by malnutrition. Fortunately, I did not find out until long after my danger of infection was past that 90% of Baghdad boils are syphilic in origin. At least I could do something about these, for although I have never been able to cure myself of fainting at the sight of blood, I have a reasonably strong stomach for pus. The only surgical instrument I could find, it was part of the anti-snake bite outfit, was a lancet, and with it I proceeded to open boils. My patients, who must have been appreciative, for they came in increasing numbers every evening, suffered agonizing pain, for I often released a thick green torrent which would have overflowed a breakfast cup. But none of them even winced or made a sound, although 3 of them keeled over in a dead faint, which caused great amusement among their fellow sufferers. The last time I treated them was on the evening before the great dust storm. I had experienced several minor dust storms and one bad one when I was spending 10 days with Hall and Leslie at Canford. That dig was only about a mile from the house, but Ham and Hall, who began to drive back for shelter the moment it started, were going round in circles for an hour before they finally found their way home. On that same afternoon, Seaton and 3 of the others had been on their way back from Baghdad to Tel Asma, and although the moment they saw the dust cloud on the horizon, they drove fast down towards a village, they failed to reach it in time, and had to huddle in the car for 3 hours, breaking through scarves soaked in ginger beer, of which there happened to be a 2 dozen case in the boot, to prevent themselves being suffocated. It was early in an afternoon at the end of February, and I was working in the Umbar with brilliant sunshine streaming through the windows when the great dust storm began. In less than 5 minutes, it was too dark to see what I was drawing, so I switched on the lights, a 100-watt bulb at each of the room. In another 5 minutes, the light bulbs were only a pale glow in the darkness, like the nimbus from the top of an old-fashioned lamppost in the blackest of London fogs. Leslie came to fetch me, and we groped our way back to our room to make sure that the servants had shut the windows. Already everything was filled with dust, and our feet left clear prints on the layer which covered the floor tiles. Every window in the house had well-fitted steel frames, which normally kept the air indoors relatively clear. By the time we got to the sitting room, the noise of the wind was so loud that we had to shout to each other. 4 hours later we had dinner, a cheerless, gritty meal of tins opened in the dining room, as anything not in a sealed container would have been unedible by the time it was carried across the kitchen courtyard. The women had their hair tied up in scarves and looked like caricatures of females in the middle of spring cleaning, and everyone's face was blurred and ochre-coloured with the layers of dust which made penthouses of their eyebrows and turned their faces into masks, grotesque as clowns. We hung wet sheets over the windows, stuffed, rolled up rugs under the doors, but still the dust filtered in. By midnight our eyes were red and sore. Tempers were beginning to fray, except Joanne's, who was always at her best in adversity. No one felt inclined to go to bed, for breathing was already sufficiently hard work to make sleep impossible. Rachel took her temperature and found it was over 101. She was wondering whether she had flu or something more drastic, when I suggested that, as a perfectly healthy man's temperature often rises to 101 at the end of 5 sets of real tennis, it was possible that the panting we were doing was producing a similar effect. So we all took our temperature, at least it was something to do, and discovered that my theory was right. No one was under 100, and most of us were over 102, which cheered Rachel considerably. Dust storms never last more than 6 hours, or 7, or 8, or 9, we told each other as the night crawled slowly past. Only the clock and Abdullah bringing tea, which he had managed to make on a primus, all the other servants having long since thrown in their hands, told us that dawn had officially arrived. As the day, which was still as black as the blackest midnight, crawled on, the wind increased instead of abating. Seaton, with a thick woolen abibas over his head, fought his way across the courtyard to a window on the windward side of the house and reported that a dune nearly 20 feet high had developed beyond the outer wall. Everyone became even more depressed, for a storm as severe as this one meant that thousands of tons of dust would have been deposited in the dig pit, undoing months of laborious excavation. The season's work would have to close down. As soon as the Antikas were divided into the half which was allowed to Chicago University and the other which was claimed by the Baghdad Museum, we would disperse until next year. This was depressing news, as except for the last 24 hours, I had been thoroughly enjoying myself, and I knew that once it was over, I should enjoy remembering the dust storm. It was not drab, like money worries and illness, but dramatic. So it came under the heading, "Today's adversities are the funny stories of tomorrow," a private slogan which I have often found comforting. I was feeling odd. My temperature was now over 103, but Leslie shouted in any car that as we had promised Gillian in my ear that as we had promised Gillian to get home only in time for my birthday, we could spend an extra 3 or 4 weeks in Egypt. So I was cheerful, even when Hans decided that we had better retreat to the store cupboard, as it had no windows. At the beginning of the season, it had been piled high with cases of tins from the Army and Navy store in Fortnum and Mason's, but now it was nearly empty. The air inside it, though still so thick that we could only breathe through wet cloth, which had to be frequently wrung out in buckets of water, was a little clearer. We could at least see each other, although the sight was not very appealing. None of the men had been able to shave, and the women looked even more dilapidated. I had been too long being sorry for my own discomfort to worry about the diggers. But as my feelings of claustrophobia increased, I was appalled by the thought of them lying in their sleeping holes, no better than shallow graves, with only a strip of straw matting to protect them. I was told repeatedly that Arabs are used to dust storms and as a race would never have survived unless they were very able to look after themselves in storms such as this one, which was remarkable only because it had come so early in the year. "Oh, why won't it rain?" I said miserably. Nobody answered. Why wait for rain, especially as there had been practically none for 4 years? I lurched to my feet. "I shall make rain," I declared dramatically, and tottered out of the store cupboard. Luckily, the sitting room was on the lee side of the courtyard, and so I opened it without difficulty. But once I was out of the shelter of the wall, the wind caught me and sent me sprawling on my face. For a moment I thought I was going to lie there helpless until I was smothered to death. Then the pain of dust scouring my unprotected forehead — I had a towel tied over my nose and mouth — whipped me into action, and I crawled on hands and knees until I'd reached the haven of my bedroom. It was not much of a haven, for the dust, which is finer than talcum powder, had made drifts over everything. But at least I could stand without being blown over. I unfolded a rug and put it over the bed, on which nearly a foot of dust had collected, and lay down. Then I began to pray for rain. I prayed until the sweat ran in runnels down my face. Exhausted as I was, I began to feel exultant. I felt the virtue entering into me. My prayers were going to be answered. I began to talk to the rain as though it were a separate deity. Suddenly I heard my own voice, which had been inaudible because of the roaring of the wind. The wind was abating. I stripped off my clothes and stood naked, shouting to the rain to come to me. Suddenly I realized that the only sound I was hearing was my own heartbeat. There was no other sound. Then, in the silence, I heard an insistent musical sound. a tune played on one note, like a drum beat, and yet metallic. It was the first heavy drops of rain falling on the corrugated iron roof. The separate notes blended into a symphony of rain, surged into the triumph singing of a torrent, and I found myself standing naked in the courtyard with clear, clean water sluicing down my body, breathing great gulps of fresh, wet air into my lungs. Then I remembered the others, and also to put on some clothes before I went to find them. It rained for 12 hours in a 4-mile circle around the house. No rain fell anywhere else in the district, and during the night over 100 people were smothered to death in the streets of Baghdad. For 3 days we were marooned. The house and the ancient mound on which the diggers lived were islands in the middle of a lake. The dig pit was full of water, which did far more damage than a dust storm. "Next time you make rain, you had better specify how much you want," said Leslie. But he said it fondly. For a few hours the others were grateful and even a little awed. Then it became only an odd coincidence, and they grumbled because the water had damaged their toy. That was the end of chapter 5. Today is Friday, the 4th of August, 2023.